Around 3 a.m. I received a call from Miss Monroe's housekeeper, Eunice Murray. She told me she was worried because Miss Monroe's bedroom door was locked and the light was still on. I told her to go knock on Miss Monroe's bedroom door and to take a look through the bedroom window, and then to call me right back. Mrs. Murray called back about 5 minutes later and told me that Miss Monroe was lying on her stomach with the telephone receiver in her hand, and that she looked strange. I had gotten dressed in the meantime. So I told Mrs. Murray to call Miss Monroe's personal physician, Dr. Hyman Engelberg, and then I quickly made my way over to Miss Monroe's house. Once there, I broke her bedroom window and climbed into the room. She was lying naked and motionless on her bed. When I took the receiver from her hand, I realized that rigor mortis had already set in. Dr. Engelberg arrived a short time later and declared Miss Monroe officially dead. He and I talked a couple of minutes before he called the police around 4 a.m.
I received a message from the telephone exchange around 8:30 p.m. that I should call Milton Evans. I called him. Evans told me that he'd received a call from Peter Lawford. Lawford was worried because he had called Marilyn Monroe, and her voice had gotten weaker during their conversation and had almost gone out altogether. When he couldn't hear her any more, he'd hung up and tried to call back, but the line was busy from this point on. Milton asked me to call Miss Monroe and ask whether everything was okay. I called her around 9 p.m. and got Miss Monroe's housekeeper, Eunice Murray, on the phone. I asked how Miss Monroe was doing, and Mrs. Murray assured me that Miss Monroe was fine. After I heard that, I figured that Miss Monroe was probably just having one of her moments of depression. I could never have dreamed that she was in such trouble.
I tried to call Miss Monroe collect 3 times that day. The first time I called around 2 in the afternoon. I could hear the operator talking to Marilyn's housekeeper, Mrs. Murray. She told the operator that Miss Monroe wasn't home. I called the second time around 4:30. Mrs. Murray answered the call again, and once again I couldn't reach Miss Monroe. I called for the third time around 7 at night. This time Mrs. Murray said that she would see whether Miss Monroe would come to the phone. Miss Monroe was on the line a short time later, and we talked for a while. Among other things, I told her that I wouldn't be getting married after all. I know that it must have been around 7 o'clock because when I called I was watching the 5th or 6th inning of the Angels-Orioles baseball game.
It's been claimed I told the press that I didn't invite Peter Lawford to the funeral because he could have saved Marilyn's life and hadn't. I would like to clearly state here that I never said anything of the sort to the press. The decision to limit the number of the funeral party was solely based on the wish to avoid hurting the feelings of Marilyn's many friends by forgetting to invite them.
Miss Monroe went to her bedroom around 8 in the evening. I later noticed through the door that her light was still on in her room. I went to her bedroom door a second time around 3:30 to check on her. The light was still on. I knocked on the door, but Miss Monroe didn't answer. That seemed strange to me, so I went around to her bedroom window. I could see through the closed window that Miss Monroe was lying on her stomach. The position she was lying in seemed very unnatural to me, so I called Miss Monroe's psychiatrist, Dr. Greenson, and he arrived a short time later. Dr. Greenson broke the bedroom window and climbed into the room. He found Miss Monroe motionless on her bed.
Peter Lawford was first questioned regarding the events of August 4th to the 5th, 1962, 13 years after Marilyn's death in 1975.
First, I'd like to say that I think almost everything that's been written by Slatzer, Scaduto, or Mailer about Marilyn's last days is pure fantasy. I think I should know, since Marilyn was a regular weekend guest at our Santa Monica beach house. On August 4th, 1962, I called Marilyn Monroe around 5 p.m. to invite her over to my house. She seemed despondent over the loss of her contract with 20th Century Studios and some other personal matters. I tried to persuade her to forget her problems and join us for dinner. She said she'd think about it. I called her a second time between 7:30 and 8 p.m. to ask her when she was coming by. Marilyn made a very depressed impression on me, and she was slurring heavily. She told me she was tired and couldn't come. Her voice got weaker and weaker, and it was hard to understand her. I yelled at her, hoping to wake her up. Then she whispered something very strange. Say goodbye to Pat, say goodbye to Jack, and say goodbye to yourself because you're a nice guy. Then the line went dead. I thought she'd hung up and tried to call her back several times, but her line was busy each time. I got worried and called my old agent, Milton Evans. I told him I thought something was wrong with Marilyn and that I was going to drive over to her place right away. But Evans talked me out of it. You know how agents are. He said he would call her doctor or her attorney instead. He was then able to reach her attorney, who told Milton that Marilyn was fine. I thought everything was okay then, since I talked to Marilyn several times on the phone when she was in that kind of state. That evening wasn't the first time her voice had sounded like that. But I couldn't get rid of the gut feeling that something terrible had happened to Marilyn. And I'll never forgive myself for not having driven over to her house that night. About 3 weeks earlier, we'd invited Marilyn to come with us to Cal Neva, where Frank Sinatra was headlining. One morning when I woke up, my wife told me that Marilyn had apparently overdosed on sleeping pills the night before. She must have fallen out of bed when she was discovered. Fortunately, they were able to revive her without professional medical help. As far as Robert Kennedy is concerned, I'm quite certain that Bobby wasn't anywhere near Los Angeles on either the 4th or the 5th of August. If he had been, he would have stopped by at our place for a swim in the pool. I didn't know until the We article came out that Bobby was supposed to have been in the city. I recently spoke with Hugh Hefner, who publishes We. Hefner told me that if he had read the article beforehand, it wouldn't have been printed.
This tape is highly classified and should be immediately destroyed once it has been heard.
I was a CIA agent when our organization planned a covert foreign action in the 50s. The mafia bosses Sam Giancana and John Roselli were hired by the CIA to assassinate dictator Fidel Castro. In return, our boys promised them large amounts of money and the control of the Cuban casinos, as soon as the old system was back in place in Cuba. When Robert Kennedy became U.S. Attorney General in 1961, he declared war on organized crime. He summoned Giancana and his ally, the infamous union boss Jimmy Hoffa, to an investigative committee and really tried to crack down on them, but then our boys called him off. He was informed of the CIA's covert action. This ruined his plans of smashing the mafia's organization. Robert Kennedy, who started a passionate affair with Marilyn Monroe, must have told her about the CIA plan and other secret activities in a weak moment. Marilyn, who hung on every word he said, wrote everything she heard from Kennedy in a red diary. And then this is what happened. When Marilyn realized that Robert Kennedy was going to leave her, she threatened to call a press conference, publish the contents of her diary, and go public with their affair. If I remember correctly, the press conference was set for 2 days after she died. But what Marilyn didn't know was that her house had been bugged by the mafia, and probably by our boys too. The only question is, who wiped Marilyn out? Did the mafia kill Marilyn to prevent information about their activities from going public? Or did they want to deal a political death blow to their arch-rival Robert Kennedy by mixing him up in his mistress's murder? Or did our boys at the CIA want to silence Marilyn to prevent a political scandal of international proportions and to protect the U.S. Attorney General?